Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for another CData Coffee Break webinar. This one focused around integrating with your B2B business partners. My name is Matt Springfield. I'm a product specialist here at CData. I focus on CData Arc, which is the product we'll be bringing up. Just a note here at the top that this is being recorded and we'll provide you with a recorded video after the event. And the idea of these coffee breaks is to be nice and short, just about 15 minutes, so you can enjoy a hot cup of coffee and it'll be over at the end. So to respect your time, let's just jump into things. So first, what are we covering today? Now, the first point to bring up is why should we value end-to-end B2B integration? Why are we talking about this in the first place? Second point is what makes B2B integration difficult? Why is it not a simple conversation? Why is it not just make it happen? Third is, of course, how CData Arc simplifies those B2B challenges to make it easier for you. We'll jump into a live demo, which is an important focus of today. And of course, we'll have open Q&A at the end. Since it is short, not going to get to too many questions, but if you have those questions, please do drop them in the Zoom Q&A tab, and I'll get to them at the end. So with that said, why value end-to-end B2B integration? Why is this an important conversation? The short answer is that B2B transactions depend on an alignment with your backend systems, but that might not make too much sense, might not be clear just yet. So let's dig into what that means. So first, B2B just, of course, describes the exchange of messages with your external partners. So whenever you talk to some other business, B2B, business to business, that's that communication. And it's not enough in today's world to just exchange messages with your external partners. Those messages have to be aligned with your backend system. And there's a few ways that we can see this happen. So first, that first bullet point, you want to be able to update your partners in real time. The idea here is that your outbound B2B messages, so you're talking to somebody, sending messages out, that often depends on and includes information from your own internal data ecosystem. So I'm going to use an example here from the retail sphere, but of course, the same principles apply to lots of other industries like logistics and healthcare and finance and so on. But let's say you're a retailer, and when your product inventory gets too low, you need to go contact your supplier to get some more of that product. Well, we can see now that it's the backend events of your inventory getting low. That's something that happens inside your data ecosystem, some alert or trigger. That's what actually fires off this need for a B2B communication. So what we want to do is make sure that any real-time updates on our backend automatically get converted into the necessary B2B exchanges that we need to execute. So if we have truly end-to-end B2B integration, where one end is our backend and the other end is our external trading partner, then we have this nice seamless pipeline between something happening important in our backend and then the necessary B2B transaction corresponding to that. So that's the first point. The second point is kind of the same thing, but the opposite direction. So now our partners are sending us messages, and our inbound B2B messages need to get integrated into our internal data ecosystem. So let's stick with that same retail example, though again, I could use different examples from different industries. Let's say that we're a retailer and we've just purchased some new products to restock our inventory, and our supplier has just invoiced us for the product that we just purchased. So that invoice is coming into our systems. It's a B2B message, but we almost certainly need to do something with that invoice that we just received. That involves integrating it into our backend. Maybe there's an accounting platform that we use, like QuickBooks Online, that we use to keep a ledger of these transactions. Maybe it's just as simple as updating our accounts in our CRM, like Salesforce. So we want to make sure we register that this account has a new order associated with it. Maybe it's just a database or a data warehouse where we stick all these transactions to make sure we just have visibility into these sorts of purchase transactions. Whatever backend systems we're using, we almost certainly want to take the information that our partners have sent us via that B2B message and somehow stick it into our own internal data ecosystem. So together we can see that both outbound messages and inbound messages are going to be tightly coupled with our internal data ecosystem, with our backend systems. And so we want to make sure that our B2B messaging is truly end-to-end, which takes into account our own backend systems. And finally, we want to eliminate automation gaps. So it is possible to tackle these problems with a piecemeal solution, a bunch of different systems. So maybe you have one system that exchanges files with your partner. That's the truly specific B2B part. And maybe you have a different system that handles the content of those messages, maybe an EDI translation software. Then maybe you've got a third system that loads data into your backend system, another system that moves data around like an ETL tool. But of course, the problem with this is that it one, it introduces friction. Anytime you have different systems sort of passing data off to each other, you introduce the problem of making sure that they talk to each other well. Second, it might introduce the possibility of needing to have manual intervention. And of course, you never want to have to manually enter data or manually trigger processes. That slows things down and opens up risk to human error. And finally, this might be a little overlooked, but it makes it harder to handle errors. If you have multiple systems dealing with the same transactions, then when something goes wrong, it might be hard to trace back the source because, again, multiple different systems have touched it, and it might not be clear where the ultimate root of the problem lies. If you have one smooth end-to-end automation pipeline, then you can, of course, always see where the problems arise, maybe what step caused it, maybe alert anybody who needs to be alerted about that, and resolve those errors as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's why we think that B2B, end-to-end B2B integration is valuable. But what makes it difficult? Why is this, a conversation that lasts more than a few minutes? Well, I've picked out 4 reasons. You could probably pick out more, but I'll stick with these 4 for today. The first is various different transfer protocols. So when you communicate with your B2B business partners, you use some sort of protocol to communicate so that they know what you're saying. The problem is that these protocols involve different technical specifics, and different partners might use different protocols. So whenever you need to talk to your parties, your external parties, you might need to implement all of these different technical protocols in order to make that happen. The second issue here is the different data formats. So B2B documents and your internal data ecosystems speak different languages. I'll use EDI as a common example for B2B documents. EDI is a very standard format for sending business documents to partners, but there's no database or SaaS application or accounting platform that produces or reads EDI. EDI is a very specific format for this document transfer, and all of your backend systems are going to use some other data format. So you need something that's going to work with the disjunction, the incongruity between the data formats that you're sending messages with and the data formats that you need for that fully end-to-end automation. The third issue here is backend integration. So of course, if you want this end-to-end data pipeline, you're going to want that pipeline has to talk to your backend. So, there's a wide range of different kinds of backends that people use. I mentioned some databases, CRMs, ERP systems, accounting platforms, data warehouses. Whatever tool you're using for your end-to-end B2B automation is going to have to be able to talk to and integrate with those backends. So that's another hurdle to overcome. And then finally, business logic. So the simplest example of this is, let's say you're receiving different kinds of documents from a partner. You need some sort of ability to route those documents to different places, handle them differently, depending on what kind of document they are, depending on what kind of data they contain. So there's a simple routing need here to make sure that you're handling different documents appropriately. But then there's another kind of business logic that maybe gets overlooked, which is lookup logic. So the common example of this is, let's say you get an order and the order has an account name, maybe your first and a last name. But in order to add that order to your CRM, like Salesforce, Salesforce has an internal account ID, and that's how it keeps track of what account you're talking about. Now, of course, your business partner isn't going to know the internal ID in Salesforce of their account. They just know their own name. So they send you their name, and you now need to go look up that internal ID, account ID, based on the account name that they sent you. So that ability to go look up critical values, internal values, based on the sort of public information that you have tends to be a fairly critical part of making these end-to-end automations actually work in the real world. So that brings up CData Arc. CData Arc is, of course, CData's enterprise B2B integration solution. And where does that fit? Well, it's probably clear, given the challenges that we just mentioned, that CData Arc fits right where those challenges reside, in between your inside network and the outside network, which essentially we mean your partners. So CData Arc sits in the middle and is able to talk to both your internal data ecosystem, your backend systems, your SaaS applications, your databases, and so on, and is able to communicate with your B2B partners, is able to exchange files, translate EDI, create EDI documents, that kind of thing. So of course, the role of CData Arc is to be that fully end-to-end data pipeline that extends from your backend systems, your inside network, to your partners, the outside network. But we don't just want to support end-to-end B2B integration. We want to simplify B2B integration. After all these challenges, if it's a headache to deal with, then how much value are you really getting there? So how does Arc actually make this easier? Well, the key to efficient, affordable B2B integration is to cut out complexity. And so there's at least 3 ways that CData Arc cuts out complexity. The first is the ability to connect to partners in just 3 steps. So this is the external network communication part. So no matter what protocol you use, CData Arc makes it all look and feel the same. So it really doesn't matter if your partners are using a variety of different transfer protocols. It all has the same simple 3-step process in Arc. And again, we're going to do a live demo, so we'll show you that in a second. The next point is kind of the same, but for the other end of the end-to-end integration, you can integrate with your backend in just 3 steps. And again, CData Arc makes every backend look the same. So even if you're using a SaaS application like Salesforce or QuickBooks, we make it look like you're using a simple database like SQL Server, so that no matter what you're using, it all feels the same. You don't have to worry about the complexity involved. And finally, we have any-to-any data mapping with a simple visual drag and drop designer. So this is, of course, solving that challenge of different systems having different data formats. Oftentimes, you have to write code to solve this and perform complex operations. We just have a simple drag and drop visual designer. So as long as you know where your data resides, you can simply map your data elements between formats with a drag and drop, just 1 click. So that's enough talking about CData Arc. Of course, a big part of these coffee break webinars is showing you the product in action. So we're going to hop into a view of CData Arc here. If you haven't seen it before, this is the flows canvas. You can see I already have a data automation workflow here. You can probably intuit this, but the whole concept is we have a toolbox of connectors here on the left, categorized by function, and you drag them into the canvas and connect them with flow arrows. Each connector does one specific thing with your data, like sending and receiving it, maybe translating it, maybe routing it, and then passes that off to the next connector in the flow automatically so that you get that full end-to-end automation data pipeline. So this example that I have here on the screen, we're just going to walk through real fast. This is going to be, again, specific to either the retail or supplier manufacturer realm, but of course, CData Arc can handle much more than that. I'm just using this as I have to pick some example or another. So if you don't use these specific documents or this specific backend, don't worry. Of course, the purpose of Arc is to make this all feel the same no matter what specifics you're using. So this is a sample flow that comes prepackaged with CData Arc. If you're not aware of this, we have these sample flows that cover a wide range of industry use cases that you can get started with. To be frank, this sample flows aren't going to just simply solve your problem. So you shouldn't expect to drag this into the canvas and immediately have your B2B integration. There are all sorts of specifics that we couldn't capture, things like your AS2 ID, things like the exact table structure of your backend. But this is, of course, meant to be a really useful jumping off point so that you can have a clear idea of what your next steps are and how to tweak things to get this to work for your environment. So with that said, let's jump into this flow here. So the flow is handling receiving purchase orders, which are EDI 850 documents, from a partner, let's say a retailer, and we're going to integrate that into our backend. So this is a simple one-directional flow where we're receiving documents and integrating that into our backend. Of course, you can imagine a similar flow in reverse to go send documents out, but we're just going to stick with the simple example here. So there's 4 steps to this. We have an AS2 connector that's going to receive the actual file. So AS2 is a transfer protocol, one of many that we support. We've got an X12 connector. That's like an EDI connector. That's going to translate the EDI document we just received and validate it and turn it into XML, which is a much more workable format. Then we're going to map that document from one XML structure to another. Namely, we're going to map that XML structure into something that fits our SQL Server tables. So at the last step, we can take that XML that matches our SQL Server structure and actually insert it into our database. So altogether, this 4-step process is going to receive a document from our partner, an EDI document, and integrate that data into our backend, which in this example is SQL Server. All right, so let's dig into each step of the process very quickly. So I mentioned that you can connect to your partners in just 3 steps. So what does that actually look like? Well, if you're familiar with AS2, you'll know that there's 2 things that you need to set up in AS2. You need to set up your own profile, which is about your AS2 information, and you need to set up your partner's profile, your partner's information, which has to do with their identifier and their stuff. So we'll start with our stuff. Our stuff is configured in the Profiles tab. So I'm going to click away from this flow really fast. And to show you that our AS2 profile has a few simple configuration parameters. This is the full screen here. And like I said, there's 3 steps. There's 3 important things to pick out here that are going to be most relevant. So the first is our AS2 identifier. This just lets people know how to refer to us in a MFT context, an AS2 context. So right now, simple arc. That's the first step, is just make sure you've configured your identifier. The second step is the certificate. So this is a digital certificate is what you use to encrypt and sign messages. Obviously, AS2 is a secure protocol. You want to be able to, make sure that data is encrypted and signed, and we use certificates for that. If you don't already have a certificate, you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can always create a new certificate with a simple process here. This is a self-signed certificate, which is almost always perfectly fine for AS2 communication. Finally, the last step, I know there's more configuration here, but the last critical step is the receiving URL. So right now, I just have Arc running on my local machine, localhost. Of course, in a production context, then you would have this hosted on some domain. And so you'd be able to see what domain and what port your AS2 system is running on. So these 3 steps, the identifier, the certificate, and the URL, are what you need to connect over AS2. And so now, since we need both our profile and our partner's information, we'll hop back over to the flow and do those same 3 steps in this AS2 connector. So in the same way that profile page was our AS2 information, this AS2 connector is our partner's AS2 information. And then with that, we'll have all the AS2 information. So right here in the connector, we're going to do a similar process here. The AS2 identifier is ARC. And now I'll bring up something kind of strange that's going on. Since this is a self-contained demo, I've actually configured this AS2 connector to send to itself. So basically, I'm making my partner's AS2 information the same as my own information so that I send to myself. And that's just so that I can kick off this flow without having to actually receive a file from some external party, since it's just an example. But hopefully you can see how this simulates receiving a file is sending a file to myself. And that's just like receiving a file from the outside. I just have a little bit more control over it. Obviously, you wouldn't do this in a real production environment. So we've got our AS2 identifier. That's step 1. That's the same as our profile arc. We've got our partner URL. That's another step, and that's the same as a URL from our profile, if you recall that local hosted AS2 endpoint. And then I'll scroll down a bit, and our third step is this certificate, and you'll notice that's the same certificate as we had created in our profile. So those 3 steps are the same, and that's all that you need to connect to AS2. Now you might say, well, what about all this other stuff? It just seems like there's more configuration data here. And that's true, but these are all intended to be used in their default settings. So you can mess with this, things like, you can decide whether you want to sign and encrypt your data. Of course, we heavily recommend that you sign and encrypt your data. You can turn off the MDN receipts. That's how you get notification that your partner received the message you sent them. But of course, we heavily recommend that you keep that on so you know that they received it. So there is more stuff that you can do here. You can change the encryption algorithm. But of course, this is all intended to be used as is. And the 3 steps that you need to worry about, the 3 things that we can't really know in advance, are the AS2 identifier, the URL, and the encryption certificate. So that's connecting to your partner in 3 steps in both the profile and this connector. So we've got our connection to our partner now, and we can send and receive files with them. What do we do with those files afterwards? Well, the next step is this X12 connector. So like I said, it's going to translate X12 into XML so that we can process it further, map it, and so on. And it's also going to validate that X12, the EDI, based on some parameters here. It's going to make sure it's sent from the right party. Excuse me. It's going to make sure it's the right document standard. It's going to make sure it's a valid EDI document and all that good stuff. And once it's done translating it into XML, it's going to pass it off to this XML map connector. So there's a decent amount going on in this connector. I don't have time to dig through all of the details here, but I'll give you the upshot. So this is our workhorse data transformation connector in CData Arc. And what that means is we have a process of manipulating data by converting everything into XML and then mapping between XML structures and then maybe translating it from XML to something else at the very end. So you notice I mentioned that this EDI connector translated our EDI document into XML. We also have an XML model of the SQL Server table, which is what you can see here. And so now the process of getting our EDI data into SQL Server is just to transform our EDI XML into our SQL Server XML. So everything is XML. Now we're just changing the structure of that XML to match what we want. And the way we do that is with a simple drag and drop process. So you can see these lines in between elements in the source and the destination. This is to establish these lines. You simply drag and drop, and you can choose what value goes where. So the idea is if you know that your document number is an 850 and you know where in your destination that value needs to go, you simply drag it from the left onto the right to establish that mapping relationship. Now, these sample flows come with a prepackaged mapping to give you a sense of how this works and a sense of like sort of what values you're looking for. Of course, we can't know everything about your destination. We can't know exactly how you want to store your data. So these mappings are not going to be perfect for you right out of the box. But again, hopefully it gives you a sense of how to get going and tweak it for your specific use case. And this, again, is our one of the ways that we simplify this process of B2B integration is to turn that data manipulation, that data transformation from potentially a coding project into simply dragging and dropping. So there's no coding required here. I've gone off screen. So with that, we've mapped our data from the EDI document received into a format appropriate for SQL Server. And the last step, of course, is to actually insert this data into SQL Server. So we'll go to the SQL Server connector. I mentioned that in the same way that connecting to your external partners only takes 3 steps, connecting to your internal systems only takes 3 steps. So you can see what I mean here. The first step is to actually establish a connection. Now, I have a connection already established just to save us all the embarrassment of me messing this up live. But let's look at what that connection establishing would look like if we were doing it the first time. So I've just clicked add a new connection here, and it's just asking me for a few simple parameters. The server that SQL Server is running on, in this case, it's just my local machine, so it's localhost, the port, the name of the database within there, some user credentials. So if we just fill in some very simple parameters, very simple values that you can get, then we would establish our connection and be able to talk to SQL Server. And so once again, we can make sure that that's already working for this connection that I already set up. So that's step 1, simple connection parameters, kind of like a connection string if you're used to working with databases. The second step is the action. So this is telling us how we're going to interact with our backend system. In this case, we have upsert set. Upsert is a combination of update and insert. If you're familiar with database language, insert is adding new records to a database. Update is updating existing ones. And so this is basically just pushing data into our backend, into SQL Server. We could, of course, choose other things like select is pulling data down, lookup is performing that business logic that I talked about, and stored procedures, depending on what you have configured, can do lots of different things. One thing to mention here is even though this is using database terminology, one big key use case or thing to understand about Arc is that we make everything that's in your backend look like a database, even if it's not. So if you're using Salesforce to manage these records, even though Salesforce isn't a database, it still has the same setup as a database. You've got tables like orders, and those orders have properties of data objects. That's very similar to tables and columns. So we can make Salesforce integration look like SQL Server integration and feel exactly the same by abstracting away all the technical specifics and just giving you the same 3-step process. So don't worry if you're saying, oh, I want to integrate with QuickBooks Online. How does this work? What's an upsert? It's the same thing as in a database context. The third step here is simply to choose what data you're working with. So in this case, we're receiving purchase orders. So I've picked the sales order and sales order line items table that we're talking about. But let's just show you what this would look like. So let's say you're configuring this fresh. You would hit this Add New Tables button, and Arc is going to go talk to the backend system, in this case, SQL Server, and just ask it what tables are available and list them here. So this is dynamically read from the backend system. So you just hit add table, you go find the one that you're interested in and you click it and say add. And that's the whole process for just picking the data that you want to work with. So you don't have to worry about the structure of the database and all these specifics. You just need to click this and know what data object or table you want to talk to. All right, and we could get more complex and choose different columns and set various properties, but we'll keep this nice and simple and default. So again, that establish connection, set the action, and choose your data objects or tables is the 3-step process for communicating with your backend. And we're coming up on time here, so let's go ahead and run the flow to show that it works, and then we can have a few minutes here for questions. So the first thing that we want to do is kick off this flow by sending an AS2 message to ourselves. And like I said, that's a very strange use case, but it's simulating as if we were receiving it from somebody else. So hopefully that's clear, not too confusing, even though it is weird. So the next question is, what are we sending to ourselves? What's the example here? Well, I have an example EDI document. This is an 850 purchase order. If you haven't seen EDI before, you might immediately notice it's essentially unreadable to humans. It's a very technical standard spec. So yeah, obviously we don't want to spend too much time working with this. The machines understand it. We don't. But this is an 850. It's a purchase order. So it's telling you what got purchased and how much it costs and all that stuff. So we're going to upload that file here in the AS2 connector. And again, usually you're just going to receive this from your partner, but we're sending it to ourselves to simulate that, which is why we have to do this extra step of uploading it here. All right. So the automation in this connector is actually going to pick this up automatically. I don't actually have to send it. I just refresh this view to see that this is successfully sent. Now, since we're sending to ourselves, it should be also in the receiving bucket in our output. Because this is where where data would go if we had just received it from a partner. So in this case, we sent it to ourselves, but this is where the data would be if we received it from a partner. So it's here in this output. That's that same file, obviously, and it gets passed along the automation flow. And so it's already actually been handled by each of these connectors sort of in real time, as fast as it can process them. So we can catch up with this data here at the very end of the flow in the input tab. And I've disabled the automation for this particular connector just so that we can do this last step together. But this is our translated XML file of all of this purchase order data. We can see that what was an EDI document has been converted into something that fits the data structure for our database. Now, it's still, you have to look at this for a while to understand what's going on, but hopefully it's clear that we've taken what is a pretty esoteric specific format and converted it into something that just matches our sales order and sales order line items structure for SQL Server. And that allows us to actually process it. So that translation and mapping step converted EDI into something workable for our backend. And the last step here is just to send it and integrate it into our backend. So there we go, connecting to the local SQL Server database. Now I can show you the database if you don't believe that the data is actually there, but the point here is that the same data that we received from our partner as an EDI document is now successfully integrated into our backend system, which in this case was SQL Server. So again, there's a lot going on here. It's a quick demo, so I understand that I went fast, but hopefully it's clear that the process of connecting to your partners and connecting to your backend is fairly simple. The process of mapping in between is a simple drag and drop user interface. And we do a lot of work to make sure that the data that you're working with is as simple as possible by doing things like translating EDI into XML, so that you don't have to worry too much about the format and the technical specifics therein. So that concludes the demo portion for today. I am going to hop back into our slideshow here and open things up for questions. So we are coming up on time. I didn't leave myself very long. There's just one question I'd like to get to here, which is a good one. So Elias asks, is Arc only a local application? I assume that he's referring to it being installed on localhost, which is my own machine, of course. And I wanted to mention that no, Arc is a web application that can be installed on your local machine, in your network, or in the cloud. Arc Cloud is a fully cloud-hosted version of this application. So if you're looking to do a cloud-only network, then that would be totally fine. Unfortunately, I always talk longer than I mean to, so we are squeezed for time. I'm going to follow up with any of the remaining questions over email, but for the sake of respecting your time, I'll close things out with the next steps here. If anything was interesting, you can learn more at arc.cdata.com. We do have a free, fully functional trial. If you want to get your hands on the application and see if it's actually as simple as I say it is, arc.cdata.com/trial. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can email sales@cdata.com, and we're happy to do our best. So that wraps us up right here on time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.